Sussex, November 1814. The morning call had not been requested, and had not been expected, and had arrived at Ashworth Hall on a Wednesday in the form of a woman the Duke of Ashworth had never met, whose name he had been given once over supper by his mother's oldest friend, and had immediately dismissed as irrelevant. The woman's name was Seraphine Caldera. She was 26, the only surviving child of Joaquin Caldera, who had built the largest textile concern in the north of England from a warehouse in Leeds with 17 looms, and the conviction that fabric was a better foundation than land, because fabric moved and land sat still. Seraphine had been running the full operation since she was 23, when her father's eyes had begun to fail him, and he had said to her across the breakfast table, "You will take the books, you will take the correspondence, you will take the negotiations. I will take my tea and my opinion, and you will ignore my opinion whenever it is wrong, which will be more often than either of us would like." She had come to Sussex because the Caldera mills required a particular grade of long-stopple wool, produced in limited quantity on exactly 4 estates in the south of England, and one of them was Ashworth. She had written ahead. The letter had been addressed to the Duke's steward, a man named Greaves, and had outlined in professional language the nature of the inquiry, the volume of wool required, and the terms she was prepared to discuss. It had been clear and competent, and entirely without social pretension, and this was precisely what had caused the difficulty, because it had not occurred to Seraphine Caldera that a letter about sheep would require social pretension, and it had not occurred to the Duke of Ashworth that a letter about sheep from a woman was anything other than an imposition dressed in commerce. She arrived at 10:30 in a hired carriage, wearing a traveling dress of dark blue wool made from Caldera cloth, a choice she considered both practical and, in the context of a wool negotiation, a relevant credential. She carried a leather case containing the correspondence, the flock records she had obtained from the County Agricultural Society, and a set of figures she had prepared the previous evening at the inn in the village, because Seraphine Caldera did not arrive at negotiations unprepared. Greaves met her at the door. He was a man of 55, with the carefully maintained neutrality of a servant, who had survived 3 generations of Ashworth temperament by developing the ability to convey information without appearing to hold an opinion about it. He showed her to the morning room. He offered tea. He told her the Duke would be informed of her arrival. She waited. The morning room was well kept, but cold, not from temperature, but from disuse. The chairs had been placed for appearance rather than conversation, an arrangement that told her something about how frequently this room received actual visitors, and the answer was rarely. She moved one of the chairs closer to the window, where the light was better, opened the case, and began reviewing the flock records. She had been waiting for 11 minutes when she heard the voice. It came from the entrance hall, through the morning room door, which Greaves had left slightly open, and it carried with the clarity of a man accustomed to being heard without raising his volume, and who had never had reason to consider who else might be listening. "She will not be receiving visitors," the Duke said. "I have the morning accounts to review, and I am not available for social calls. Send her away with the appropriate courtesy, Greaves, and make a note that future correspondence of this nature should be redirected to the estate office rather than the house." Greaves said something she could not hear. The Duke's voice came again, closer now, as though he were walking toward her. "I do not care what the letter contained. I did not read the letter. A woman I have never met does not write to my steward, and then appear at my door on a Wednesday morning and expect an audience. This is not a shop. She may leave her card if she wishes." Seraphine set down the flock records. She closed the case. She stood, and she was standing, composed and entirely visible, in the center of the morning room when the Duke of Ashworth walked past the open door on his way to dismiss her through his steward without having met her. He saw her. He stopped. She watched the recalibration cross his face, the brief, involuntary sequence of recognition, reassessment, and the discomfort of a man who had been caught saying something he would have said regardless, but would have preferred to say without an audience. He was 31. He was tall, dark-haired, with a face that was well-made and slightly gaunt, one that had been better looking 2 years ago, before whatever had taken the weight from it. His eyes were gray and sharp, and presently occupied with the project of deciding what to do about the woman standing in his morning room, who had heard everything. "Your Grace," Seraphine said. Her voice was level. Her posture was that of a woman who had been conducting negotiations with men who underestimated her for 7 years, and understood precisely when the other party realized their error. "I'm Seraphine Caldera," she said. "I wrote to your steward 3 weeks ago regarding the dovetail flock, and I have been waiting in your morning room for 11 minutes, during which I have reviewed the county flock records, moved one of your chairs because the arrangement in this room is designed for people who are not expected to stay, and heard you instruct your steward to send me away because you did not read my letter, and have decided that a woman you have never met does not warrant the inconvenience of a Wednesday morning." She held his gaze. The room was very quiet. "I am not a social call," she said. "I am a commercial inquiry from the largest textile concern in the north of England. Your dovetail flock produces 400 weight of long stipple wool per season that meets my specifications, and I am prepared to contract for the full yield at 8 shillings above the current market rate, a premium your estate accounts would find significant, as I suspect you are aware, given that Ashworth has been operating at a deficit for at least 2 years. The silence that followed belonged to a man who had entered a room with a position and discovered that the position had been disassembled before he had finished stating it. "You moved my chair," he said. "The light was insufficient for reading where it was placed," she said. "You moved a chair in my house." "I moved a chair in your morning room, which is a room designed for visitors, and I am a visitor, though apparently not a welcome one." He studied her for a long moment. His face had settled into something beyond the initial discomfort, something that wasn't irritation, and not quite the other thing, the thing that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of interest. "Miss Caldera," he said, and his voice had dropped from the register he had used with Greaves into something more direct and considerably less certain. "You appear to know a great deal about my flock and my accounts." "I know a great deal about wool," she said. "Your accounts are an inference based on publicly available information about the Ashworth estate and the current state of the South Sussex agricultural economy. The inference may be wrong. It is not usually wrong." Then he did something she had not anticipated. He stepped into the morning room, closed the door behind him, pulled the second chair to the window beside the one she had moved, and sat down. "Show me the figures," he said. She did not sit. "Your Grace, you have just told your steward that this is not a shop, and that I may leave my card. I am aware of what I said, and now you are asking to see my figures." "I'm asking," he said, and something in his face shifted, a directness that matched her own, and was costing him something to produce. "Because you have just told me that my estate is operating at a deficit, and you said it with the certainty of a woman who has done the arithmetic, and I have spent 2 years surrounded by people who will not say that sentence to my face. So yes, show me the figures." She sat. She opened the case. She showed him the figures. They spent 43 minutes at the window, and in those minutes, she learned 3 things about the Duke of Ashworth that the county gossip and the agricultural records had not told her. The first was that he understood wool, not in the general way of a landowner who employed a competent shepherd, but in the specific, technical way of a man who had spent time with the animals and the fiber and the grading process, and had formed opinions based on direct observation rather than reports. Dukes did not, in her experience, know the micron count of their own fleece. The second was that he was lonely, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that nearly an hour of uninterrupted conversation about fleece contracts and flock rotation revealed by what it was not. He had not spoken to anyone like this in some time. She could tell by the way he listened, the genuine attention of a man who had been starved, of someone who spoke to him in direct sentences about real things and was drinking it in without being fully aware he was doing so. The third was that he had a wound. Twice during the conversation, when she had made a point with particular directness, he had watched her with something that was not about the fleece, and then turned away with the deliberate control of someone closing a drawer that had opened without permission. Someone had hurt him. Someone who had been direct. Someone who had been in his life and had used that access in a way that had made him build the policy she had heard through the door. She will not be receiving visitors. She filed all 3 observations in the place where she kept important information, alongside micron counts and contract terms. She did not ask about the wound. She was here about the fleece. She would stay here about the fleece. At 12:13, by the clock on the mantel, the conversation reached its conclusion. She had presented the terms. He had listened. He had asked questions that confirmed he understood the value of the offer. He had not agreed. "I will consider it," he said. "The offer is available for 14 days, she said. After that, I will approach Lord Denning at Hartwell Grange, whose flock is smaller, but whose terms may be more readily agreed. You have a secondary option prepared." "I always have a secondary option prepared, Your Grace. It is a habit of negotiation." "It is a habit of someone who expects to be refused." She held his gaze. "It is a habit of someone who does not confuse patience with dependence." He watched her with the look of a man who had walked into a room intending to send someone away, and was now considering the 14 days he had been given before she went of her own accord. "Good morning, Miss Caldera," he said. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. She collected the case. She returned the chair to its original position, because she was a guest in someone else's house, and guests did not rearrange the furniture permanently, however much the furniture needed rearranging. She walked to the door. Greaves was in the hallway, maintaining the professional composure of a man who had heard 43 minutes of conversation he had not expected, and was processing it behind a face that revealed nothing. "Thank you, Greaves," she said. "The tea was excellent." She walked out of Ashworth Hall into the November morning, into the hired carriage, and was on the road back to the village before she allowed herself to consider anything other than the figures. She thought about the voice through the door. She considered the man who had said it, and the man who had sat down 30 seconds later and said, "Show me the figures." And she turned over the distance between those 2 men, and she thought it was both very small and very large, and that she was not the person whose business it was to close it. She almost convinced herself, by the time the carriage reached the village, that Ashworth was entirely about the fleece. His reply came on the 9th day. She had not been counting, except that she had, automatically, and without admitting to herself that this particular count had nothing to do with commerce. She was at the inn, the Plough and Harrow, where she had taken a room for the duration because she did not conduct business from a distance when proximity was available, and because Sussex in November had a quality of light in the mornings that she had not expected and was not prepared to give up before the 14 days expired. She had spent the 9 days productively. She had visited Lord Denning's estate at Hartwell Grange, inspected his flock with the same thoroughness she brought to all options, and found the wool adequate but not exceptional. His terms had been agreed within 20 minutes because Lord Denning understood the value of a fair offer and did not require 9 days to recognize one. She had also learned, during the 9 days, what the wound was. Lady Ashworth, born Cecily Drummond, had died 18 months ago of a fever that took her in 6 days, and had taken from the Duke something the county had watched him fail to recover. Not with dramatic collapse, but with the slow, methodical withdrawal of a man replacing every human connection with a procedure and every room that had contained her with a policy for keeping others out. She will not be receiving visitors. The phrase, she now understood, had not been about her at all. It had been the standing instruction, the default. The policy that had replaced the person, applied to every door and every morning until a woman with a leather case had been standing behind the wrong one and had heard the whole machinery of his grief in a sentence addressed to his steward. She considered this information with the careful attention she brought to anything that changed the terms of a negotiation without changing the negotiation itself. She was still here about the fleece. His reasons for being difficult had become clearer, but clarity about someone's reasons was not the same as taking responsibility for them, and she was not going to confuse the two. The letter arrived on the morning of the 9th day, brought by a boy from the Ashworth estate on a horse that was too good for a message boy, a detail that told her something about how this particular correspondence had been prioritized. It was in his own hand. Miss Caldera, I have reviewed your terms. The premium is acceptable. The volume requires discussion. As the full yield commitment presents complications, I would prefer to explain in person rather than in correspondence. I propose Thursday next, 10 o'clock, at the East Pasture, where the dovetail flock is kept. You will want to see the animals. Ashworth. She read it twice. She observed that he had written it himself, rather than dictating to Greaves, and that the decision was therefore not merely commercial. She observed that he had proposed the pasture rather than the house, somewhere open and without doors that could be left ajar. And she observed the last sentence. You will want to see the animals. It was not a question. It was a statement about what he believed she would want, and it was correct. And the correctness meant he had been paying attention during those 43 minutes in a way that went beyond figures. She sent back a single line. Thursday, 10 o'clock. I will bring my grading kit. S. Caldera. Thursday was cold and bright in the way of Sussex in late November, when the downs showed their bones through the thin grass, and the sky was the color of something that had made up its mind. The East Pasture sat on a gentle slope below the main house, bounded by hedgerows on 3 sides and an oak fence on the 4th, and from the gate she could see the whole of the dovetail flock spread across the hillside, 200 animals moving with the unhurried purpose of creatures who had been bred for this particular ground. She arrived at 7 minutes to 10 because she wanted to see the flock without his narration first. The dovetail sheep were remarkable. She knew this within 4 minutes because she had been grading wool since she was 14 and could read a flock from the way the animals carried their coats in the cold. The density and the hang and the luminous quality that long staple fiber had when it was genuinely exceptional rather than merely good. She was crouched beside a ewe, running her fingers through the fleece at the shoulder, where the fiber was longest, when she heard the gate. He came on foot, which surprised her. Dukes in Sussex rode. His walking told her something, though she was not certain what. He was wearing a practical coat, and he was carrying a flock book, the sort that recorded breeding lines and lambing dates and yield per animal over multiple seasons. He stopped at the gate. He watched her crouched beside the ewe with her hands in the wool and her grading kit open on the grass, and something crossed his face that he did not immediately put away. He held it for a moment, and then he closed the gate behind him and walked toward her. You are early, he said. I wanted to see them without commentary, she said. She stood. There was lanolin on her gloves. She did not wipe them. The fiber at the shoulder is running 6 inches. Your shepherd is doing something right with the winter feed. Turnip and hay in a ratio my grandfather developed, he said. The shepherd thinks it is his own invention. I have not corrected him. The volume complication, she said. You mentioned it in your letter. He surveyed the flock, and for a moment his face held something that was not about commerce at all, but about stewardship, about the weight of being responsible for things that lived and breathed and depended on decisions made in offices and pastures. The full yield, 400 weight. The commitment would leave nothing for the Nettleford weavers, who have purchased from Ashworth for 3 generations. They take 80 weight per season at the standard rate. You are protecting a local arrangement, she said. I am honoring an obligation, he said. My grandfather's. Continued by my father. Continued by me. At the standard rate, which is 8 shillings below what I am offering. Yes. That is a considerable sum to leave on the ground for a handshake your grandfather made. He met her gaze directly. Miss Caldera, I am aware of the arithmetic. I am also aware that the Nettleford weavers employ 14 families, and that the wool from this flock is the foundation of their operation, and that if I redirect the full yield to your mills, those families will have the winter to find an alternative supply in a county where there is no alternative of this grade. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the downs and moved through the fleece of the animals around them. 320 weight, she said. I will contract for 320 at the premium rate. You retain 80 for the Nettleford arrangement. Your estate receives the benefit on the majority. The weavers keep their supply, and I receive enough volume to justify the quality. You are adjusting your terms. I am resolving your complication, she said. It is what I do. You do it very quickly. Speed is a function of practice, Your Grace. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the negotiation required. Agreed, he said. She extended her hand. He took it. The glove with the lanolin on it, the hand of a woman who had been grading his fleece before he arrived and had not cleaned up for his benefit. The grip was brief and firm and entirely professional, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not 1 second longer. I will have the contract drawn and sent to Greaves by Monday, she said. Send it to me, he said. She raised an eyebrow. You told me once that I should not write to your steward and expect an audience. Now you are asking me to bypass your steward entirely. I am asking because Greaves, while excellent, does not know the difference between 6-inch fiber and 4-inch fiber, and I prefer to discuss wool with someone who does. He turned toward the gate. At the gate, he stopped. He did not turn around. Miss Caldera, Your Grace. The chair, he said. In the morning room. It is still by the window. I have not moved it back. He went through the gate and was gone across the field before she could answer, because a man who had told his steward to send her away had just told her he had kept her chair where she put it, and he had set it while walking away, and that was the only way he could have set it at all. She stood in the east pasture with the grading kit and the lanolin on her gloves, and considered a chair that had not been moved back, and a man who honored his grandfather's handshakes at personal cost, and the 14 families in Nettleford who would not know that their winter had been secured by a negotiation in a sheep field in November. The contract was sent on Monday. His acknowledgement came on Tuesday, in his own hand, 3 lines confirming the terms, and ending with a sentence that had no commercial function whatsoever. The Nettleford weavers send their regards, though they do not know to whom they are sending them. She read this sentence 4 times. She put the letter in the case and told herself she was keeping it for the file. The wool, she was increasingly aware, was not the entire file. December brought an early frost that tested the Ashworth drainage and revealed a weakness in the lower pasture that threatened the winter housing for the dovetail flock. It also brought an invitation from Mrs. Thornycroft, wife of the parish rector, who functioned as the social architect of the local county, invisibly and entirely structurally. The invitation was to a supper at the rectory on the 2nd Friday of December, 12 guests, the full local circle, and it was extended to Seraphine with the warm, assessing courtesy of a woman who had heard about the wool negotiation and the 43 minutes and the chair by the window and had formed her own conclusions. Seraphine accepted because refusing a social invitation from the rector's wife in a county this small was a declaration she did not intend to make, and because she was curious about how the Duke of Ashworth conducted himself in a room that was not his own. The supper was on a Friday evening in the rectory dining room, smaller and warmer than she had expected, furnished for comfort rather than impression. 12 guests. The Duke was seated at the far end of the table when she arrived, in conversation with Thornycroft about the parish drainage, and he glanced up when she entered, and the glance was the one from the pasture, the one he had stopped putting away. She was seated between Sir Hubert Crawshaw, who was 70, and knew everything about Sussex sheep husbandry, and was delighted to have found someone who wanted to hear it, and Miss Pelling, who was 20, and going to London in the spring, and whose excitement was genuine and infectious. She talked with Sir Hubert about fibre grades, and with Miss Pelling about the city, and was aware, throughout all of it, of where the Duke's attention was directed, because she had developed in 4 encounters an understanding of his attention that was more precise than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. He was following her conversation with Sir Hubert. She could tell, because twice he had responded to something Sir Hubert said that he could only have heard if he had been tracking a conversation 4 seats away while conducting his own, a skill she recognized because she possessed it herself, and the recognition of a shared skill in another person was, she had found, one of the more dangerous forms of attraction. After the meal, Mrs. Thornycroft appeared at her side. "You have made quite an impression on Sir Hubert," Mrs. Thornycroft said. "He has not spoken about sheep with that much enthusiasm since his wife died, and that was 11 years ago." She paused. The pause had purpose. "He does not come to these suppers willingly," Mrs. Thornycroft said. She did not specify who. She did not need to. "I invite him because he must be invited, and because a man who has closed every door in his house needs at least one he cannot close, and my dining room has been that door for 18 months. She glanced across the room. "He has not stayed past 10 o'clock since Cecily died. It is 10:30 now." Seraphine looked at the clock on the mantel. It was, in fact, 33 minutes past 10. "I am not drawing conclusions," Mrs. Thornycroft said. "I am noting a data point. You seem like a woman who appreciates data." "I'm here about wool, Mrs. Thornycroft." "Of course you are," Mrs. Thornycroft said with the serenity of a woman who had been told the same thing in different words by different people, and had maintained her own assessment throughout. "The wool is excellent. Sir Hubert will confirm it." The Duke appeared beside her during a pause in the post-supper circuit. "Sir Hubert will now consider you an authority on long staple wool, and he will write to you. He writes very long letters. I am telling you this as a courtesy." "I welcome long letters about wool," she said. "You would," he said. There was something in his voice that was not the formal register, and not the pasture. One, but a third, the one she had heard once during those 43 minutes at the window, when he had said, "Show me the figures," with the directness of a man who had been starved of honest conversation, and had not been aware of it until someone provided it. "The drainage in the lower pasture," she said, because the frost had been on her mind, and because talking about drainage was safer than talking about the 33 minutes past 10. "The frost will have exposed it. If the housing floods, the fleece quality will suffer. You are concerned about my drainage. I'm concerned about my wool supply. The drainage is incidental. That is the concern of the estate, not the buyer. It is the concern of anyone whose contract depends on fleece condition, and fleece condition depends on the housing, and the housing depends on whether that lower channel holds through January. I do not separate the links of a chain because some of them are not technically mine." He was quiet for a moment. The drawing room moved around them, the fire in the grate, the clock past the half hour. "Would you be willing to look at the lower pasture?" he said, very quietly. "I would value your assessment." She held his gaze. She understood what he was asking, and it was not entirely about water management. She understood what she would be agreeing to, and it was not entirely about fleece. "Send me the survey plans," she said. "I will review them before I come." "Send them to the inn," she added, "not to Greaves." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, but the architecture of one, the foundation being laid for something that had not yet been built. "Good evening, Miss Caldera," he said. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. He left at 11. Mrs. Thornycroft, across the room, caught Seraphine's eye and said nothing, and the nothing said everything. She walked back to the plow and harrow alone, through the village lane where the December air smelled of wood smoke and frost, and she thought about what Mrs. Thornycroft had said about closed doors and open ones, and about a man who had not stayed past 10 for 18 months and had stayed until 11 without appearing to notice, and about what that meant for her plans, which had been about wool and were becoming about something considerably more complicated. The survey plans arrived Saturday morning. She identified the problem within an hour. The lower pasture channel had been designed for the original flock size, half the current one. Increased herd traffic had compacted the soil along its path, reducing the fall, and the frost had finished what the compaction started. The housing would flood by January if it was not addressed. She drew up a solution directly on the back of his plans, because there was something satisfying about putting the answer on top of the problem. She sent the annotated plans back Monday morning with a note. "The fall needs regrading along the North Channel. I have marked the sections. The work should be completed before the January freeze, or you will lose housing capacity for 40 animals, which will affect fleece condition, which will affect my contract. I am invested in your drainage. S. Caldera." She considered removing the last sentence. She sent it with the last sentence. His reply came Monday afternoon. 2 lines. "Your proposal is sound. I have instructed the work to begin Wednesday. Will you oversee it?" A. She went to Ashworth on Wednesday. They spent the morning in the lower pasture with his foreman Drouet, who was 60 and competent, and studied her annotations with the reluctant respect of a man who was going to need a few minutes to process the reluctance before the respect was fully available. She showed Drouet the fall line. She explained the regrading. She answered his questions with the patience of someone who had learned that competence, applied consistently, converted skepticism into deference at a rate that was slower than she would have liked, but more durable than any argument. The Duke stood at the edge of the work and observed how Drouet's manner changed over 40 minutes, from reluctance to attention to something that resembled deference. He observed how she moved through the pasture, reading the ground the way she read wool, with her hands and her eyes, and the accumulated knowledge of someone who understood systems. When Drouet had gone, and the pasture was empty, except for the 2 of them and the sheep, the Duke said something that stopped her. "Cecily would have liked you," he said. She stilled. She was direct, he said. He was looking at the channel, not at her, and that was how he said things that cost him. She said what she meant. She did not arrange her opinions for other people's comfort. It was the thing I loved most about her, and it was the thing that made losing her feel like losing the last person who would speak to me in complete sentences. He paused. I built the policy after she died. The doors, the visitors, the standing instruction to Greaves. I built it because every person who came to the house came with condolences and performances of sympathy, and none of them spoke to me the way she had, and I could not bear the difference. I told myself it was about privacy. It was about the absence of her. He turned toward her. "And then you were standing in the morning room, and you had moved my chair, and you told me my estate was failing with the assurance of a woman who had done the arithmetic, and you sounded like a complete sentence." She held his gaze. She considered what he had just said, which was the most he had revealed about himself in any of their encounters, and which was not an apology exactly, but was the ground an apology would be built on, and she respected him for laying the ground without rushing the construction. "I am not a replacement for your wife," she said. Her voice was level and kind, and entirely without softness, because softness wasn't what this moment required. "I am not a version of her. I am not the return of something you lost." "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. I am learning the difference, he said, between someone who reminds me of what I had and someone who is something I have not encountered before. The learning is not finished. No, she said, it is not. They stood in the lower pasture in the December cold, and neither said anything further, and the silence was not uncomfortable, and it was not empty. It was the silence of two people who had said enough for one morning, and were not going to be impractical about the rest. She walked back to the inn, and tried not to think about his voice saying you sounded like a complete sentence, except that she thought about it for the entire walk and for the evening after, and she fell asleep with the annotated plans on the bedside table and the knowledge that she was no longer in Sussex about wool, and had not been since the 9th day, and that the only person she had been convincing otherwise was herself, and she had not been doing it well. The Christmas assembly was held at the home of a man named Beresford, a baronet of 58, with an estate 3 miles east of Ashworth, and the particular confidence of a man who had inherited his position young and had never been required to earn anything that followed it. Seraphine had heard his name at the Thornycroft supper, mentioned in the careful manner people used when they wanted you to know something without being responsible for having told you. 30 guests, the winter circle, the full social machinery of a community that had been observing the wool negotiation and the drainage visits and the supper where the Duke stayed past 10 and had been constructing its narrative with attentive dedication. Seraphine arrived with Mrs. Thornycroft, who had developed the practice of collecting her from the inn without either of them having discussed the arrangement, which was how Mrs. Thornycroft made things appear inevitable rather than arranged. The Duke was across the room when she entered, and he glanced up, and the glance was not the managed one. It was the other one, the one from the lower pasture. The evening moved. She talked with Sir Hubert, who had written her the long letter the Duke had predicted, and to which she had replied with equal length. She talked with Miss Pelling. She was aware of the Duke 4 conversations away, and he was aware of her, and neither of them was pretending otherwise anymore. Beresford arrived at her elbow during a pause. She had seen him approaching for several minutes, his trajectory too deliberate to be casual, and she had observed the audience he had selected, 6 people within comfortable hearing, placed with the care of a man who had been staging these moments for decades. Miss Caldera, he said with a smile that was about to be pleasant in a manner that was not pleasant at all. I understand the wool contract is signed. Quite the achievement for a visitor. Thank you. One wonders, he said, with the theatrical timing of a man who had been rehearsing, how long the visitor intends to remain now that commerce is concluded. Sussex does enjoy its seasons, but we are a county of settled residents, and there is a certain character to the permanent community that is, naturally, difficult to appreciate from the vantage of an inn. The word inn did the work he had designed it to do. In a different voice, it was a neutral fact. In his voice, with his pause, and his audience, and his smile, it meant you are temporary. You are trade. Your time is expiring. She held his gaze. She had heard this melody in Manchester wool exchanges and London contract rooms, and every space where a man with position encountered a woman with competence and found the combination intolerable. She was composing her response when the Duke's voice came from behind her right shoulder. Miss Caldera has been at Ashworth 3 times this month, at my invitation to address a drainage failure that has threatened the estate's flock housing for 2 winters, the Duke said, in a voice she had not heard before. Not the morning room voice, not the pasture voice, not the supper voice. The one beneath all of them. The one that had the full weight of Ashworth in it, and knew precisely what that weight could do. Her assessment identified the problem in an hour. The repair she designed is currently saving 40 animals and 6 years of breeding work. He turned his full, unhurried attention to Beresford. The wool contract she negotiated preserved the Nettleford weavers' supply at a cost to her own margins, a decision that benefits 14 families in this county. If there is a question about the character of this community, I would suggest it is answered by the people who contribute to it, not by the duration of their accommodation. Beresford's smile underwent the rapid recalibration of a man who had miscalculated his audience and was discovering the error in real time. Of course, I merely meant to acknowledge the county benefits, the Duke said with quiet economy, from people who take their obligations seriously. I believe we are agreed on that. He returned to his conversation as though the interruption had been minor, and Beresford found a reason to be elsewhere with the efficiency of a man who needed to reassemble his position in private. Seraphine crossed to Mrs. Thornycroft, who was watching from the far side of the room with the composed attention of a woman who had been collecting data for 6 weeks and had just received the point she had been waiting for. "He made it about the drainage," Seraphine said. "He made it about the drainage and the weavers and the flock," Mrs. Thornycroft said, "so that Beresford could not make it about you, and so that the room understood his position without requiring him to declare it." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a man who is closing doors, Miss Caldera. That is the behavior of a man who has opened one and is standing in it." Seraphine held the Duke's gaze when he finally did glance up. She held it for 1 beat longer than the social register required. Then she turned back to Mrs. Thornycroft and said something about Sir Hubert's letter, and the assembly continued, and neither of them said anything further that evening, and it cost them both considerably. He came to the inn on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the assembly. She was at the writing desk in her room, working on the quarterly accounts for the Leeds mills, because the mills did not pause for whatever was happening in Sussex, and she was not a woman who let whatever was happening in Sussex interfere with the quarterly accounts. The innkeeper's wife told her the Duke of Ashworth was downstairs. She went down. She did not change her dress. She did not arrange her hair. She had stopped arranging herself for his benefit sometime during the visit to the lower pasture, and she was not going to resume. He was standing in the entrance of the Plough and Harrow, a space designed for farmers and wool merchants and travelers on the London road, not for dukes, and he was standing in it as a man aware of this, who had come anyway. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Caldera," he paused. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me several," she said. "Which one are you offering?" Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the architecture again. "The first morning," he said. "What you heard through the door." He paused, looking at a point slightly to the left of her face, his way of saying things that cost him. "I said she will not be receiving visitors, and I said it about you, and I did not know you, and I did not read your letter, and I made a judgment about a woman I had never met based on a policy I had built to protect myself from a grief I had not processed, and the policy was not about you, and the judgment was not about you, and I am sorry. I know it was not about me," she said. "I knew it in the morning room. I knew it when I heard the word visitors, because the word had the weight of something that had been said many times before, to many doors, and I happened to be standing behind the wrong one." "The right one," he said quietly. "You were standing behind the right one." She held his gaze. "I am not Cecily," she said. "I know. I have known it since the pasture, since you resolved the Nettleford complication in 30 seconds and shook my hand with lanolin on your glove." He paused. "You are not a version of anything I have encountered. You are a woman who moved my chair and annotated my drainage plans and told me my estate was failing with the assurance of someone who had done the arithmetic, and I have spent 6 weeks trying to put that in a category, and I cannot, because the category doesn't exist." "You defended me at the assembly," she said, before Beresford finished his sentence. "Why?" "Because he was wrong," the Duke said. "And I was the person in that room most qualified to say so, and the most obligated, because I had said the same thing he was saying, in different words, 6 weeks earlier. through a door I thought was closed. "Come upstairs," she said. "I have the quarterly accounts spread across the desk, and the room is not designed for visitors, and I am not going to rearrange it for a duke." "I would not expect you to," he said. The room was small and warm and entirely hers. The accounts on the desk, the case on the chair, the annotated plans pinned to the wall above the washstand, because there was nowhere else to pin them. He stood in the center of it and took all of it in with the attention of a man reading a room, and what he read was her. "You work here," he said, "every morning. The mills do not manage themselves. You pin drainage plans to the wall of your in-room. They are relevant to my contract." "Seraphine," he said. She stilled. He had not used her name before. He had used Miss Caldera and the formal register and the space where her name would go. And now the name itself was in a room at the Plough and Harrow, and neither of them could take it back. "I have been closing doors for 18 months, he said. "Every door, every visitor. And I closed them and told myself it was about privacy." He considered the plans on the wall. "And then you were behind the door, and you heard me close it. And you did not leave. You stood there and told me who you were, and showed me the figures and moved my chair, and you did not ask me to open anything. You simply stood in the room I had closed and made it impossible for the closure to hold." "I did not come to Sussex to open your doors," she said. "I know. You came about wool." "I came about wool," she said, "and I stayed because the wool was exceptional, and the drainage was interesting, and the man who owned both was the first person who had sat down and said, 'Show me the figures,' in a voice that meant it. And I have been negotiating with men who do not mean it for 7 years. And the difference was the reason I am still at the Plough and Harrow in December, with plans pinned to my wall, telling myself, it is about the contract." He stepped toward her. One step in a small room, but the step closed the distance between the formal and the actual, between the register they had been using and the one underneath it. "Is it about the contract?" he said. "Parts of it are about the contract," she said. "The parts that are not about the contract are why I am still here." He kissed her. It was not tentative. It had the deliberation of a man who had spent 6 weeks assembling evidence and had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to act on. And she kissed him back with the same precision she brought to contracts and fleece grades and every true thing she had ever decided. And the room was small and warm, and the quarterly accounts were on the desk, and neither of them required further management. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. "The drainage," she said, "is complete," he said. "The contract is signed. The quarterly accounts, are those urgent?" "They are always urgent. They are also going to wait until tomorrow, which is the first time I have said that in 7 years. And I want you to understand the significance of that statement." The corner of his mouth moved, fully for the first time. Not the architecture of a smile, the thing itself. "I understand the significance," he said. "You are going to be very difficult to conduct business around," she said. "Druette's current opinion is that the woman from Leeds is the best thing that has happened to the lower pasture in 30 years, and that if the Duke has any sense, he will keep her in Sussex permanently." "Druett said that." "Druett said most of that. The last part was my inference." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a proposal?" "It is a preliminary assessment," he said. "I find assessments useful before major commitments." "My preliminary assessment, that you are going to find it considerably more difficult to maintain a closed-door policy when the person you are trying to keep out has a key to your drainage system and the quarterly accounts of 17 mills. I have noticed that my policies have been performing very badly since November." "They have been performing terribly," she said. "I would recommend a complete revision." "I'm in the process of one," he said. He took her hand, the one with the callus at the right thumb from the pen, and the faint trace of lanolin that never entirely left, and he held it with the brief, firm grip of a man who meant what he agreed to, and then he did not let go. "Seraphine," he said. Her name, the specific, irreplaceable sound of it. "Edmund," she said back. His name, the one she had learned from Mrs. Thornycroft and had not used until now. And now it was in the room with the plans and the quarterly accounts, and neither of them could put it back. And this time, it meant everything she had not said since November. They were married in January, faster than Sussex expected, and precisely as fast as Seraphine Caldera considered reasonable once a decision had been made, and the terms agreed. The wedding was at the village church between the Ashworth estate and the road, a stone building with a Norman arch and a good east window that she had noticed on her first walk through the village in November, and had thought, with no particular reason at the time, that it was a church where important things should happen. She wore dark blue, Caldera cloth. Edmund had not been surprised. Mrs. Thornycroft had not been surprised. Her father, who had come from Leeds with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had sent his daughter to Sussex about wool and was receiving her back with a duke attached, had simply nodded when she told him, confirming something he had known since she was 12. The church was full, which surprised her, because she had been in the county for only 2 months, but Sussex had decided she belonged to it, and Sussex did not consult the people it claimed. Beresford was at the wedding, because Mrs. Thornycroft had insisted, and because it was better to have him inside the occasion, where he was required to behave, than outside it, where he would not. He congratulated them with the grace of a man who had no remaining options. He said the right things. He said them to Edmund first, and then to Seraphine, and when he said them to Seraphine, she met his eyes with the composed directness that was her natural register, and nothing further was required. Her father found her in the garden at Ashworth in the late afternoon, when the wedding breakfast was moving toward its close, and the January light was thin and clear across the Sussex downs. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "The Duke of Ashworth," he said, "the man who told his steward you were not to be received. He has revised that position considerably," she said. "And the wool?" "The wool is exceptional. The contract is sound. The drainage is repaired. The Nettleford weavers are secure." She paused. "And I am married to a man who kept a chair by a window for 6 weeks because I put it there, and who apologized in a country inn without qualification, and who defended me at an assembly by talking about drainage." Her father watched her with the attention of a man who had been observing this particular person since she was 12, and had never once underestimated what he saw. "Is he good enough for you?" he said. She considered it honestly. "He's trying to be," she said. "That is the best version of the answer." "It is the best version," he agreed. Edmund found her at the edge of the garden, where the grounds gave way to the lower pasture, and the repaired channel ran clean and straight in the January cold, and the dovetail flock grazed in the field beyond, and the whole of Sussex was doing what Sussex did in January, which was to be precisely and unapologetically itself. "The drainage," he said, "is working," she said. "The flock is healthy. The quarterly accounts." She looked at him with the expression she had when she was not managing anything at all. "Were submitted on time, despite considerable personal distraction." He looked at her with the full, undefended attention, the one that had been building since November and was now entirely present and entirely permitted. "Seraphine, I told Greaves you were not to be received. I said it through a door I believed was closed, and you were standing behind me, and you heard all of it, and you did not leave." "I did leave," she said. "I left that day. I came back because of the wool." "You came back," he said, "and you moved my chair, and you never moved it back, and I never asked you to." She looked at the lower pasture. She looked at the channel she had designed. She looked at the field, and the flock, and the man standing beside her, who had closed every door in his house for 18 months, and had found that one of them had a woman behind it, who did not consider closed doors a permanent condition. She took his hand, flat and deliberate, the hand of a woman who shook on her agreements and meant them, and she said, "The doors are open, Edmund. All of them. And I am not standing behind them. I am standing in them." He held her hand with the full, undefended grip, the one that had nothing of the morning room in it, nothing of the policy, nothing of the grief dressed as procedure. Just him, entirely present for the woman who had come to Sussex about wool and had stayed because the wool was exceptional and the man was worth the argument. The best contracts, her father had always said, are the ones you understand better after you have signed them than before. She understood this one completely.